So good afternoon. The event which will present Rick Samans' book, titled Human-Centered Economics, the Living Standard of the Nations. Before coming to this room, I checked my email. So when actually Rick sent the email to me with a manuscript, it was the January 10th. So it's around 11 months ago. He basically explained I'm working on the book. That's actually the office was a bit of in transition. And I thought, the Rick has some time to work on it. And then what he sent it's electronic version, of course. It's a long and bulky manuscript, almost 400 pages at the time. Of course, I put aside. And then it's too long of it. So it's also the beginning of the year, human-centered economics, wow. And then just by instant, I took a look at it because I was a bit bored at the time as well. As I said, office is a bit of in transition. So then I couldn't stop. I actually read the manuscript really straight away. And then I think I came back to Rick with some comments, with lots of excitement to Rick's office. I still remember at the time Rick's office was full of papers. I think that was a bit of indicating of the status of his mind at the time. It's completely confused, all different things, different ideas, and etc. Then the book I read, the manuscript I read was really amazing. I felt this is the kind of books that the ILO has been waiting for quite a long time. For many reasons. First one is that whatever we say about the ILO principles, ILO standards, still out there's a strong perception that the ILO principles are simply the cost to the economy. It's damaging the economy. Still, there's a strong perception there. And we have known this for a long time, but somehow we haven't done much work actually to bring together or reconcile this economic thinking with the ILO principles. I found actually Rick's book has done exactly that with of course, very nice way. Of course, as you know, Rick is writing so well. So even when he was lying a little bit, then probably he can be easily convinced about this. And another good thing is he's really talking about the macro story. It's not just micro. We tend to focus on the old micro story about the labor market institution, etc. And also his book actually giving a very good reminder that at the end of the day, we have to find a way of embedding the market into our society. That is exactly what the ILO is trying to do. And one thing really kind of surprised or impressed me was that in doing all of this, he's kept back to the beginning of the economics itself. So he's talking about Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Alfred Marshall. So all these actually the economists are before the Keynes. So he's bringing together all these elements, basically showing what actually the founding or fathers of economics or the founding members of economics are exactly the same things as what the ILO has been advocating. So this is quite a big argument. But once I read his book, as I said, I'm convinced more than ever. So also based on that, he just bring together the SDG and social justice, etc., with the key principles of the ILO. So this is the beauty of the book. Also very ambitious as well. And also I found some very interesting new term actually the Rick is going to present, like aggregate the social welfare function or aggregate the distribution function. So and also why this is a macro issue. In building on all this argument, he's basically linking all this economic reasoning, building on all the classical economics to the international financial architecture and the financing issues and the fiscal policies and monetary policies. For me, this is very innovative and very refreshing. Probably that's why he made quite a bold statement, which, as I said, I'm convinced, by suggesting this book actually present a new neoclassical and Keynesian and ecological synthesis. So this is actually the first time I heard about synthesis since the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. So it's really great, all of this. That's why I am so excited about this book. That's why I invited Rick Samans to the Improvement Policy Symposium we organized early this year as well. So this is a bit of a long way of saying big congratulations on the work on this such, I mean, impressive, so unprecedented actual achievement in terms of the producing such actually nice, actually much weighted actually book on the ILO issues. So what we are going to do at this seminar is that first I'm going to, of course, giving some opportunity to Rick actually to present his paper, focusing on the key argument and key findings. And then I'm going to ask the Rani to give us some initial feedback. And then if there is any need from Rick's side, I mean, probably Rick may respond to some of the questions and issues. And then I immediately opened up the floor for your questions and comments or debates. So I just want to make this seminar, it's a big celebration, but at the same time, I want to make this seminar as interactive as much as possible. So any questions and comments you have, please feel free to raise them the second part of the seminar. So this is a bit of a long introduction, Rick. So over to you, Rick. Once again, big congratulations.
Many, many thanks, Sangheon. And it's such a great pleasure to be here on the same panel with the two of you, Sangheon and Uma, who are colleagues I have enormous respect for, have been doing incredible work over the years here in the institution. And I'm lucky because they were among the internal and external reviewers of the book. So they have, the book has just come out essentially today. So few people have actually read it, unlike the two of my colleagues here. So many thanks to both of you for being with me today. This is a hybrid session, so we have people in the room, but also apparently quite a number online, and we'll be able to take questions and comments in both respects later on. But I am going to take the advantage of being on the home turf here in the ILO with fellow researchers and economists and policy practitioners to give you a fairly extended sense of the argument made by the book. Let me proceed and cut to the chase, actually, as we would say particularly in American English, that this book proposes a fundamental reform of macroeconomics to systematically counterbalance capitalism's tendency toward inequality, environmental degradation, and concentration of rents and power, in part by operationalizing within economics pedagogy and practice and policy the universal economic and social rights enshrined in the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations and the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in the mid-1960s that took those rights and put them into international legal obligations. So that may sound rather immodest and unrealistic, but let's face it, chronic shortcomings of liberal economics in respect of inclusion, sustainability, and resilience are not just a problem for economies. They pose a serious and ongoing challenge for social cohesion and political order itself, as history has tragically demonstrated many times over. And political leaders of all philosophical persuasions understand this. There have been multiple multilateral agreements and international political declarations that they've signed on to, particularly in the last decade, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, the more recent Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Agreement, and the ILO's own Centenary Declaration, Global Call to Action for a Human-Centered Recovery, and Inequalities Resolution just a couple of years ago. Taken at face value, these agreements commit the world to very deep reform of the standard liberal growth and development model. that's prevailed for decades. And what they're effectively pledging to do, although it's never really characterized in this way, but again, if you take those words at face value, they're pledging to systematically internalize considerations of inclusion, sustainability, and systemic and human resilience within the model, within the growth and development model, within macroeconomics itself. In my view, structurally reforming macroeconomics itself in these respects is key to revitalizing the liberal tradition and the multilateral system that its values were inspired by nearly 80 years ago in a new century, facing the prospect of increased inequality and environmental degradation and dislocation from artificial intelligence, climate change, and other shifts and shocks. Absent a new approach to macroeconomic theory and policy, these new forces could very well exacerbate poverty and inequality, and as a result, social intolerance and political polarization as much over the next generation as digitalization and globalization did over the previous one. They could well further undermine social justice and cohesion, in other words, which are the ultimate foundation of peace and stability, as the founders of this institution were wise enough to understand over 100 years ago in their era following war, pandemic, industrial unrest, and political upheaval. The many commitments made since the great financial crisis in 2000, 2008, and 9 to reform and rebalance economies in order to make them more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient are useful. But let's be honest with ourselves. They continue to be largely aspirational and incremental in practice, particularly when measured against these big promises that have been made in these international agreements I just cited. COP28, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change annual conference occurring right now in Dubai, is the latest case in point. Many well-meaning speeches, including by somewhere around apparently 170 political leaders, and some important new commitments, absolutely, but no truly decisive action yet that is commensurate with the scale and urgency of the challenge, if we're being honest with ourselves. This book's basic thesis is that to transcend the current pattern of aspirational expressions of intent and incrementalism on inclusion, sustainability, and resilience, to effect change at the scale and the speed that has been promised by political leaders, humanity has to answer the question of how the source code of capitalism, that is to say, liberal economic theory and the advice, analysis, and assistance provided by international economic institutions, can be rewritten to better serve a world in which distributional and just transition considerations have become at least as important to many societies as the overall size of their economies, as measured by GDP typically. And indeed, these shortcomings often act as a drag on growth itself. Specifically, we need to figure out how to reformulate macroeconomics so that it internalizes considerations of inclusion, sustainability, and resilience, so that it treats broad progress in household living standards, the lived experience of people, as an explicit rather than mainly a residual factor, a natural and inevitable and ultimately adequate byproduct of GDP growth. That's the way our minds have been taught in macroeconomics over the years. Implicitly, there is a trickle-down mental model of the way growth and a larger production in the economy filters down eventually and adequately into improved social welfare, which in concrete terms is basically the standard of living of one's household and one's community. I assert that the standard liberal economic growth model is missing half of its operating system. The rights-based, institutionally enabled part of that system that plays a critical role in translating the values of a society regarding inclusion, sustainability, and resilience, that is to say, its social contract, into economic policy. Institutions, by that I mean norms, policy incentives, public administrative institutional capacity. These things are the lifeblood, the enabler, essentially, of how you diffuse progress in living standards, how you, not only in terms of the benefits, but also in terms of widening inclusion in the process of creating economic activity. They effectively enable the broader and deeper realization of rights. your social contract won't mean very much unless it has institutions in a variety of domains, which I'll get into in a minute, to implement them. For the same reason that the ILO's founders were moved to create this institution during the post-war, post-pandemic era, 100 years or so ago, I'm concerned that this mistaken and what I consider to be intellectually lazy trickle-down assumption or blind spot of modern economics is an increasingly serious strategic hindrance for the liberal project more generally. And by that, I mean the core notions of human rights and empowerment, social tolerance, and mutually beneficial development of richer and poorer countries in a reasonably open, fair, and transparent international trading system. And it's a big impediment as well, let's be clear, to the urgent need to integrate a new core notion within this project, and that is the pursuit of all of the above within planetary boundaries of environmental sustainability. This is a clarion call for the 21st century. So that's a quick summary of what this book sets out trying to do and why, and now let me spend some time explaining how it purports to do so. I start with the assertion of some basic principles here. First, progress in people's lived experience, the standard of living of their household and community is the bottom line way people, societies, assess national economic performance. That's the point of economics, not more production of goods and services per se, which is to say GDP. I call GDP growth a top-line measure of performance, of economic performance. It's a means to broad and durable progress in material well-being or living standards. It remains important, let's be clear, for all but a handful of rich aging societies, and it's essential for very poor economies. But that is not the same thing as saying it is sufficient for purposes of maximizing improvement in living standards and social welfare. And modern economics kind of glosses right over that distinction, in my view. Economies are a social construct. Their ultimate purpose is to improve the lot of their people, the human condition, not simply to boost the amount of stuff produced. And that's what GDP measures, at market prices, no less. It doesn't measure the stuff that's produced that doesn't get a price associated with it, as my colleagues here know well. Yes, productive output often makes a general improvement in the standard of living more possible. But the relationship between the two phenomena, growth in productive output on the one hand and progress in median living standards on the other, is not lockstep. And that relationship has been weakening, particularly in upper and middle income countries, where the challenge today is not so much an absolute lack of economic activity and national income, as it is a failure to include more of the population in its production and benefits on a sustainable basis. Particularly in this century, after decades of poverty reduction and national income growth around the world. And by the way, the majority of the world's poor people live in middle income countries, not in low income countries. After that long arc, and growth has played a very important part of that, but the social quality of growth now, the living standards of nations, is every bit as important as the quantity of growth, the wealth or production of nations. The social quality of economic growth as reflected in the pace, breadth, and sustainability of progress in living standards is not treated explicitly in theory and policy in the liberal growth and development model. It's assumed essentially to flow inevitably and adequately from growth, and the book's second chapter traces decades of evidence to the contrary, notwithstanding growth's crucial importance for poverty reduction, and shows that the translation of expanded GDP into broadly based sustainable improvements in social welfare is not an automatic or consistent process. You don't have to take the empirical evidence that I've marshaled, because there's been a lot of it over the years, to take it. You just need to take a look at the political discourse around the world right now. There is a huge hue and cry among all sorts of countries at all levels of economic development, all sorts of different political systems, that these shortcomings of economics are deep-seated ones. And let me emphasize that the liberal economic model is used by countries that are liberal democratic ones, and they're used by ones that have a much more state-centered role for the way they run their economies. Those tools basically are used by everybody, irrespective of their political philosophy. So this is a problem. This shortcoming, this flaw, this blind spot, I think is a universal problem for humanity in the 21st century. Now, I'll come back to the nature and origins of that flaw a bit later. That is to say, whether the tendency of capitalism toward inequality, environmental degradation, and concentrations of rents and power is a misconception of the field or a misapplication of its original principles as laid down in classical political economy. But for now, suffice it to say that there's overwhelming empirical as well as political evidence that if we want to affect systemic change, not incremental change or not aspirations of good intentions, if we want to affect systemic change in these respects, we're going to need to structurally reform and rebalance the growth and development model, that is to say, macroeconomics itself, so that it's focused on improving the social quality as much as the quantity of growth. We'll need to explicitly, and this is what the book does, interrogate and, if necessary, retire the complacent trickle-down assumption that boosting the latter leads more or less inevitably and adequately. Boosting growth leads more or less inevitably and adequately to boosting living standards. The first 3 chapters of the book engage in this interrogation, both empirically and in the history of economic thought. And this, I move in chapters 4 through 7 into a proposed resolution in both a reformulation of theory and policy. Now, just proceeding directly to the latter, let me give you a few ideas of what concretely is suggested here as a way forward, as an improvement of the model. The essential principle I pose is that it's possible to strike a better balance between the quality and quantity of growth, and indeed to strengthen growth by improving the quality. In other words, it's possible to strengthen the quantity of growth by improving the quality of growth. But this will require retiring that trickle-down assumption and being more intentional about this matter in economics by doing 2 things. One, by viewing economies equally and simultaneously through 2 lenses: growth, which is a national metric of production, and living standards, which is a household metric of lived experience. And secondly, devoting at least as much policy attention and effort directly to cultivating the latter as the former, by recognizing, as the most influential original theorists and codifiers of the field in the 18th and 19th century did, that policies and institutions are needed in a wide range of domains to translate the added efficiency in production created by markets into broad improvement in the material well-being of society as a whole. This is what I call the golden rule of human-centered economics, this 2-lens approach. It's the inverse of relying on this trickle-down, inevitable, presumed adequate process over time that underpins the current growth and development model. It's a formula for rebalancing this imbalance of emphasis on markets over rights and institutions, production over distribution, and GDP growth over household living standards. It's a guiding principle for internalizing within a country's growth and development model the systemic importance of policies and institutions that are the practical manifestation of its social contract. That is to say, its values with respect to inclusion, sustainability, and human and systemic resilience. Now, let me be more specific. I know I've been coming at this at a fairly abstract theoretical level, but I'm going to go a little deeper into the theory here, into the model itself. Traditional macroeconomics teaches us that growth in production is essentially a function of well-functioning markets and increased or more efficiently applied inputs such as capital, labor, natural resources, and the like. But household living standards are a function not only of aggregate production, the overall size of the economic pie, but also the diffusion of the process and benefits of that increased production. That is to say, how inclusively and sustainably that pie gets produced and distributed. This is crucially a function of enabling policies and institutions in such areas as labor and social protection, financial and corporate governance, competition and rents, infrastructure and basic necessities, environmental protection, anti-corruption, education and skilling, and the like. The institutional strength in these areas, policy incentives in these domains, they enable the rights that you see in the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations and the ECCR, which is to say they're the enablers of social justice within an economy. They're necessary to operationalize the social contract, but they're missing from macroeconomics. And that's not, economics is supposed to be advancing progress in social welfare ultimately, not production per se. So let's dig a little bit into a suggestion for how to reformulate or rebalance that model. Maybe, Alessandra, if you could put on the screen the first slide. The standard liberal growth and development model helps us to conceptualize the growth process through the aggregate production function. This is familiar to all undergraduate and beyond economics students. It's just a representation of what I said before, is basically inputs, factor accumulation, and technical progress, if you will. Now, what's missing is, that's only providing half of the story. There's nothing in there that speaks to the institutionally enabled process of realizing the social contract and the rights in these facets of living standards at the household level. I represent the factors relevant to that challenge in a simple model of the main dimensions or channels by which living standards are manifested at the household level, calling these factors of distribution. Let me go to the next slide. This is analogous to the aggregate production function, but it's representing 5 quote unquote factors of distribution, which as you see represented on the screen. Households, families, standard of living is essentially a function of the employment and entrepreneurial opportunity they perceive, their disposable income, whether it be from wage or non-wage compensation, the affordability and availability of material necessities, their economic security or their capacity to withstand adverse shocks, and environmental security. Very much important. Very different dimensions of environmental degradation and pollution can directly undermine a household's living standards. It can degrade their quality of life. There are many aspects in which it's highly relevant to their material welfare, if you will. I call this an aggregate distribution function, but you could just as easily and probably more accurately think of this as the living standards diffusion mechanism that underpins economies. It's the institutional infrastructure that enables the diffusion of these aspects of living standards throughout the economy. That basically is it's the de facto income distribution system of an economy, but it's nowhere present in the standard economic and growth and development model. And I would say to you that just as policy strongly influences the aggregate production function, the growth and the size of an economy, there's been decades of advanced scholarship, all sorts of policy practice in how you optimize capital accumulation, labor participation, technical progress. That policy is hugely important for that. Same thing is the case here. Policy is critical. Institutional strength is critical for the aggregate distribution function. So this can be thought of as kind of the full panoply. Like, let's go to the next slide, of policies and institutions that really come to bear on living standards. We don't have time to go through all this, but for each one of those 5 dimensions or channels by which living standards propagate within an economy at the household level, I've kind of mapped in the book, in the 4th chapter, some of the many of the main areas of public policy and institutional strength that really matter for it. There are a lot of levers that governments can pull, and you can just kind of scroll through this. Alessandra, go to the next one, which is disposable income. While I'm speaking, you can kind of go one through the other. I'm not going to go through them all for purposes of time. This aggregate distribution function gives a fuller picture of the agency that policymakers have to transcend that lazy trickle-down assumption that as long as you kind of have growth, everything's going to work out. Everything's going to come out in the wash in terms of social welfare, ultimately, and be more intentional about systematically pursuing a more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient growth and development model. Investing more in this multidimensional policy and institutional ecosystem, infrastructure, as I say, this is the way you practically manifest your society's social contract. And doing so on an ongoing basis as an integral part of the development strategy, of the growth strategy of the country, is a way to maximize the payoff of your economic activity for what matters to people and how they assess politically, socially, how well they and their community are doing. That lived experience, that median progress in household living standards can be more completely and accurately represented in the following function. If you could go to the next, the aggregate social welfare function. No, got to go back. Oh, It seems like it's missing. Okay. So in the chapter, you will see that I've taken the production function and the aggregate distribution function, just combine those, very simple, A plus B, and it's the combination of the two that yields aggregate social welfare. And I call that an aggregate social welfare function. That's a new growth and development model. It's what I would call a rebalanced one, a one that internalizes these institutionally enabled rights-based aspects of what economics should be all about within the model itself. Most macroeconomists, chief economic advisors, finance ministry officials, they're not thinking mentally in those terms. They're thinking mentally in aggregate production function terms effectively. And so by having the discipline to have that mental model, that I think begins to open up the door to being able to scale the kind of progress that societies have committed to by agreeing to all of these improvements on the economic, social, and environmental side. Now, I would say that it's about time that pedagogy and practice of macroeconomics caught up with not only these societal expectations and political promises, but also with the profound changes in the world economy over the last half century or so. Most of the world's poor, as I said, lives in middle-income countries, meaning that the problem is as much for most countries today, an underactivation of their aggregate distribution function, a failure to invest adequately in the institutions that enable greater inclusion, sustainability, and resilience, as it is a lack of production. The pedagogy and practice needs to catch up with that. And this aggregate social welfare function, and particularly the aggregate distribution function, this mapping of institutional domains that really can propel your inclusion, sustainability, and resilience, that's the key. I mean, in effect, let's take the just transition concept here, because there's a lot of churn in the economy and we expect it to grow more. That aggregate distribution function, it gives you a fuller sense on an economy-wide level of what it would mean to implement a just transition, whether it's with respect to technological change or whether it's with respect to climate change regulation or the like. It represents the full range of policy levers that you can pull on this issue. This is a big new issue, particularly on the climate side for macroeconomics, and it needs to be considered in an ex-ante, deliberate, systematic fashion that includes the consideration of trade-offs, spillovers, and synergies between these two functions, production and distribution functions. That's really the opportunity, I think, for the macroeconomics field in the future. And we need to think more, and this model, this alternative model would help us to think more in interdisciplinary cross-ministerial terms. And indeed, I think it would install a discipline within the profession and within governments to do so. This is a different mental model, if you will. Now, let me issue a few caveats in this regard. These two new functions are not mathematical functions. They're mental models. They're heuristics. Indeed, the aggregate production function, which initially had a presumption of being a mathematical function, after lots of debate in the mid-20th century, there's wide consensus right now that it is not a mathematical function, but it's still a very influential mental model for economists. But just because these are not mathematical functions does not mean they are impervious to rigorous quantitative analysis. That is to say, analysis of what works comparatively, what the trade-offs and spillovers might be, and how to navigate them, and where are the synergies? How do you improve the quantity of growth by improving aspects of the quality of growth? The point here is that modern economics has been looking at economies through only one of these two lenses. It's sort of like a person who can only see through one eye. Their depth of field and their peripheral vision is limited, is constrained, because they're only looking through one lens, if you will. I would argue that the analytical quality and the policy advisory quality of much of macroeconomics in recent decades has been similarly analogously constrained because it's only been looking through that aggregate production function lens of the economy. It's not been looking as much at that institutional side of things. In other words, these principles and tools, which I've laid out, what I call human-centered economics, focused on the living standards of nations, which is the bottom line, whereas Adam Smith's wealth of nations is more the top line. This provides a basis for not only advancing social justice, but also growth. I think there's a lot of opportunity for synergies here. And we can get into that a little bit later, because a lot of the stuff that we work on in the ILO actually has a dual payoff for both decent work and quality of work and growth itself. These are devices for refocusing economists on the bottom line, aggregate social welfare. I think that AI, climate change, and other shifts and shocks coming at us in this century require all of us, as never before, to look at their economies with stereoscopic vision. In other words, with two lenses, through the lenses jointly of production and distribution at the same time and with equal emphasis. Chapter 5 of the book presents a lot of comparative data showing that there's often huge variation in the performance of countries in these dimensions of household living standards at countries at roughly the same level of GDP per capita. And if you could go to the slide that gives us the reference ranges here, you'll see in chapter 6 of the book that this wide variation, I know you can't really see it on the screen, but I'll characterize it for you, is in some cases hugely, huge. And this is not a question of wealth in the traditionally considered sense of income, if you will. You can interpret that variation as the opportunity costs of failing to look at economies through those two lenses simultaneously as the economy has developed over the years. Or you can interpret it in a more positive vein as evidence of the considerable policy space that nearly every country has to narrow what I call its social welfare gap. Its underperformance on key dimensions of living standards relative to the frontier of leading outcomes and enabling policy practices of peer countries, recognizing that doing so can also often help to reduce its output gap or underperformance on growth. If the macroeconomics of the 20th century was very focused on output gap, the production side of economies, and in this century in which most of the world lives in middle-income countries, we should be seeking to solve for both the output and welfare gaps of economies simultaneously, which requires us to take an institutional look. Now, to instrumentalize that, I have put together some numbers with the help of some colleagues. And you will see when you go into the book that the difference between the median and 80th percentile among countries at the same level of GDP per capita, that is to say 4 categories of low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and upper income, it typically varies on the range of 50 to 300% between the median and 80th percentile. And the median is often 3 to 6 times higher than the lowest value in that categories of countries. In other words, most countries have a tremendous amount of policy space unutilized to strengthen their social contracts, notwithstanding the inevitable differences there are going to be in their national, social, historical, and political circumstances. Use of reference ranges like these, and I presented some on the fiscal policy side, and then I've also taken our decent work indicators, which the institution has spent years developing and compiling, and I've selected a number of them. And you'll see that for all 4 levels of countries, there are these variations, if you will. Reference ranges like these that could be useful in helping to instrumentalize this alternative growth and development model to help countries see where they have unutilized policy space, where they can learn from their peers, irrespective of whether they're an advanced middle income or lower income country. Now, this essentially demonstrates that institutions really matter. These numbers, this wide variance is proof that institutions really matter for social welfare and justice, but also for growth itself. As a result, they really deserve a lot more deliberate, systematic emphasis. And that's been missing, as I've been saying, in macroeconomics for a long time, but that hasn't been the case forever. Integrating the social contract into the teaching and practice of macroeconomics may seem like a radical or even orthogonal idea. And it's true that it represents, I think, what I call a systemic theoretical reform of the field, a change in capitalism's source code. But in a very important sense, it's actually back to the future. It would merely be reflecting, or rather resurrecting, the mental model of the field's most influential original theorists and codifiers, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Alfred Marshall. The third chapter of the book is a long reflection on the history of economic thought, trying to locate what happened. You go into their treatises and you see that each one of these three people whose teachings dominated the classrooms for 125, 150 years in the teaching of economics, they were super explicit that while they were working to perfect their understanding of markets, they were explicit about the need for largely public institution and regulation in a whole range of areas that bears upon these institutional dimensions of living standards. They were, by modern standards, heterodox economists. People don't understand the popular image of Adam Smith is that he's like this pure free marketeer. John Stuart Mill, not so much. Alfred Marshall, the guy who really developed the initial curves, supply and demand curves, he said, quantitative stuff is useful, but put it in the annex. Don't put it in the main body of the text, because actually you're going to confuse people. You're going to give it too much quantitative stuff, too much emphasis, if you will. So the field kind of lost its way somewhere in the 20th century. And I kind of go through in the chapter that I don't have time to talk about right now exactly what happened there. And it's as if their pioneering work on markets kind of got lost in translation as political economy, in a classical sense, made the move into modern economic science. They were very much thinking in terms of a mixed economy, not in the narrow 20th century sense of how much the state owns of the economy or not, but in this sense about the role of institutions, mainly but not only public institutions, and what the right mix is in what areas of living standards and social welfare you needed to have those public interventions. And that aggregate social welfare function, which unfortunately we missed the slide of today, which is just a combination of these two, distribution and production. I believe this is a much closer approximation of the mental model they had when they created the field 200 or so, 150, 200 years ago. It's relevant to economies. Building out this institutional underpinnings is relevant to your economy if the state has a huge control in the economy. It owns a lot of production. It controls credit creation and allocation, or if it has a very limited. Same challenge exists. And we've been in a 50-year detour having these polemics about capitalism versus socialism, big versus small government, whereas the founders understood, actually, no, the big ball game is how you build out not only markets, but also the institutional apparatus to make sure you diffuse the benefits in the process of growth widely in the population. If you go to the next slide or two, I'm just keep going. I have to illustrate my point about this alternative way of thinking about the continuum, if you will. I have one here on the corporate governance side, which I call social market socialism. It gives you a spectrum. It's not black and white, big versus small government. It's actually more to do with what kind of institutions do you build on the corporate governance side to ensure that corporate decisions result in things that benefit stakeholders more generally. And then on the next slide, and I'm just going to breeze through this, is on the financial regulatory side. There is what I think of as a financialization, real economy investment regulatory continuum. And there are different institutional approaches that countries can and increasingly are taking to try to ensure that capital is mobilized for the real economy. That is to say, for productive investment in things that actually matter, particularly for living standards going forward. But the point here is that to give you a sense that this is really where the thinking has to go in macroeconomics going forward and move away from the old polemics. To be sure, social welfare related institutional deepening has occurred in many countries over the years, but only usually after it's been forced onto the agenda by restive politics, by protest, not the teachings and advice of liberal economics. Sangheon, he calls these Kuznets moments of political backlash, and we can maybe get into that later. But there's been construction of the welfare, welfare economies and stuff like that, but it's been mainly motivated by politics, by people reacting and saying, we want finally you to wake up. And that's happening in many respects right now, not because economists have driven that as a function of what they're aiming to in their model at all. That is effectively a systemic theoretical shift in the model that I think I'm suggesting here. It's fair to say that Keynes was the last person who was successful. I mean, there have been plenty of people, I suppose, who proposed these things. He's the last one who's really had a systemic effect on the mental model of growth and development. But his was a production function strategy. He was consciously aiming to use fiscal monetary policy to improve productive output, right? Knowing that that would be a key way to improve employment, to reduce mass unemployment and the like. He was very focused on social justice, but he was focused on the particular aspect of the problem of his day, which was a production function problem. I view my proposals here in this book as a way of reinforcing his middle way between socialism and capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism and super state-controlled socialism, as a way of reinforcing his middle way, complementing his fiscal monetary efforts with a what I call a structural and institutional approach at the same time. And I think that's particularly relevant for the reasons I said today, and given that how much the world has developed since then. I would say that these two aspects, the Keynesian and this institutional dimension, are both essential for not just improving coherence, but ex ante and systematically internalizing these social and environmental externalities in the actual code, if you will, of economics. Let me just for a moment say that for those of you who are students of the field, I also think that what I'm suggesting here is tantamount to revitalizing, reanimating two subdisciplines of economics that have been super abstract and very microeconomic for nearly a century now, which is welfare economics and institutional economics. This is a macro approach to institutional economics. It's a macro approach to welfare economics, which is super focused on utility maximization at the micro level. That's not what Smith, Marshall, and Mill were thinking about as what the end purpose of economics was. Indeed, over the next generation, humanity faces the daunting challenge of needing to chart a new middle way in economics, this time between environmentally destructive growth and socially destructive economic stagnation or degrowth. And I think the proposed model here for internalizing these social and environmental externalities, positive and negative, in the core thinking about growth and development in a country and in the classroom, creates the basis for the construction of a new, you might call it neoclassical Keynesian ecological synthesis and corresponding realization of the vision inspired by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and articulated in the 1944 ILO Declaration of Philadelphia, signed in his presence back about 80 years ago or so, and then echoed only 2 or 3 months later in the founding articles of agreement of the IMF and the World Bank at Bretton Woods. People don't realize that those first articles basically rhyme, they echo with what's in the ILO's Declaration of Philadelphia, because that just occurred only a few months before. So I'm now going to move to the end here and open it up. The book has in chapters 5 and 6 quite extensive specific policy recommendations, particularly in chapter 6 on what it means for international macroeconomic policy analysis and advice, the international financial architecture, and international trade and technology governance. We don't have time to cover that in the opening set of comments, but let me just make a final point and say that I think that this project, if you will, to try to shift macroeconomics, modernize it in a way, as I said, is quite crucial on the political side as well in this century. You can see how much polarization, dissembling, erosion of social cohesion is going on right now. You can see the building frustration that we're not moving really decisively on climate change. You can see the dislocation that people are worried about from artificial intelligence and all other aspects of algorithmic automation. I think that we now need to kick into a scaled mode, a systemic mode of behavior, move beyond the incremental and the aspirational, and that's what this is intended to do here. I think that if we did this, we meaning policymakers and economists, we would have a positive effect on the quality of political discourse, on the revitalization, if you will, of the liberal values that are very well reflected in the multilateral system in the United Nations Charter and the like. These, when people are stressed and they're feeling like they're getting cast aside and their things are out of control in the economy and their own lived experiences not being properly looked after, they tend to get less tolerant of others, if you will. And I worry about that both within economies as well as among economies at the international level. So I like to think of this as not only an economics agenda, but also an agenda for improving the prospects for peace and stability in the world. And that, after all, is what animated the creation of this institution. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm also amazed. I mean, you actually summarize it more than 300-page long actually book in a such a very nice way actually. And listening to Rick, I mean, I was reminded. I mean, so many different things actually occur to me. This is indeed a bit of the ILO synthesis of the modern economics towards the ILO agenda. And also somehow I was reminded actually the ILO in the 1970s where ILO is trying very hard to engage ourselves with the global community on the development issue. That's when actually the ILO created the World Improvement Program. And that's where we are very much engaged in the really development agenda, structural transformation, all these issues. And also I was reminded, I didn't know actually when I read actually manuscript, the Wick's book actually reminded me about the Mariana Mazzucato's book on the mission economy and the value. I mean, so there are lots of books on that. So it's really good to have all different feelings. They're all positive. So I just want to thank once again, Rick, to your great work on that. So, Uma, so over to you.
Thank you so much for having me here, Rick. And it's a real honor. And first of all, congratulations for this valuable piece of research, because I think the organization can learn a lot from it. I enjoyed reading it in February when you first sent it to me. Or rather, you sent it to me in January, but I took time only in February to read it. And I'd like to tell everyone that this is easy to read for even non-economists. It's written in a very, very simple way. And there were parts of it, I think it was chapter 3, when you get into the history of economic thought, where I could remember reading Robert Halbronner's History of Economic Thought. And there was a point that I came up, I said, okay, well, he's quoted it, I can leave him alone, because that would have been one of the comments that I would have written. And I think this book should be read by everyone in this organization for CLEAR. For me, one of the biggest takeaways that I take from this book, as you very rightly say, is breaking away from the neoliberal trickle-down model of growth and what you call it as the human-centered approach, which has a longer name, the neoclassical Keynesian ecological synthesis. And while I digged a bit more deeper into it, and you're very right in saying that it's not a mathematical model, and it's much more a heuristic approach or a heuristic model to look at. But it also reminded me, and there are pieces in the book that you see, at a point of time, I was wondering whether this is a development of those models that you had. One is the high equity growth model that came out in East Asia, which led to the export-oriented growth model, where they also talk about institutions, where they also talk about institutions for education, for labor market reforms, for minimum wages, and SME support, housing, labor regulations. And there's another part which was super interesting. You quote the 2008 report, which is a Blue Ribbon Commission report on growth and development, which has the ecological dimension, environmental dimension, because they get into the issue of the beyond GDP growth rate. But having looked at them, and I was thinking in my head, this seems to be an extension of that, right? Because if you look at the East Asian growth model, they encompass the economic indicators and the social indicators in a way, and this one is the ecological indicators. But I think I'd like to remind ourselves that the East Asian growth model, which was very highly celebrated in developing economies, and many developing economies wanted to go towards that export-oriented growth model, actually failed with the 1997 Asian financial crisis. And I'm just wondering what went wrong then as we embark on trying to bring together the two together, because you're adding to that the ecological environmental dimension. So I think a bit of your thoughts around that would be good. And the second thing I'd like to raise within it is, how do you look at these models to be developed at the national, international level? What would it look like? How should we actually take it forward? How do you actually operationalize it? And especially at the current juncture when you have production of goods and services operating globally. So, you know, many of the models that came by earlier were closed economy models to a very large extent, operating at a national level. You did open up with certain indicators, but then it didn't really, there was a lot of containment that happened, right? So I think a bit of your thoughts around that would be very good. And I'll take you then for another question.
Yeah, I think perhaps I think Rick, you want to respond right now? Yeah,
Whatever
please do. I can stand we have around 30 minutes, so probably we'll have time for the discussion.
So the Asian financial crisis had, you know, a range of factors, but particularly economies were going for growth. They were opening their markets, both also on the capital account side. There are monetary reasons that underpin it. But yes, I would say that people often have not understood what you just referred to, which is that what the World Bank called in its 1993 landmark report, the East Asian Miracle, was, yes, it was a production function strategy, but actually they identified several specific domains of institutional deepening, which Sangheon would know about very well, which were crucial to getting high growth and high equity, if you will. And that was never really formalized as a learning, in my view, in the field. And so then the other part of that question is, well, how do we formalize that? What would it look like in practice? One part of that, I think, is that, you know, if people start to think in this two-lens model, then they should be beginning to ask, okay, where do we stand on the strength of our household living standards in these dimensions? And then relative to our peer countries. And that's an empirical investigation. Not entirely difficult to mobilize if that's what you put your considerable army of economists on, that exist within many governments and certainly within international institutions. And then go one layer below that and say, well, where we see particular gaps, underperformance among countries that are just as quote unquote rich as us in certain areas of household living standards, let's take a look at their policies and institutions and what can we learn from them. That's the practical way to begin to bring this forward. That's on the domestic side. Now, I'm going very fast because I took a long time in describing the book, and I want to give people a chance to have some back and forth here. On the international architecture side, it has big implications for what, right now we have a macroeconomic analysis and advice process, which is basically focused around the IMF. Yes, the bank and the OECD for advanced countries principally are involved in that, but it's really the IMF because the IMF is the lender of last resort, if you will, if you get into a balance of payments crisis. They have influence. And the IMF has a notion of what they call macro criticality, which is very much what you might think of as a macro financial notion of criticality. So, and that you can't blame them too much because that's the mandate they've been given. Now, the last two managing directors should be applauded, credited for trying to move them out of that box of just looking at fiscal and monetary sustainability over the short, medium term. But they're in that box. And frankly, they don't have the mandate. And so they have a lot of sort of internal cognitive dissonance when they try to translate the aspiration down to the operational advice they give to countries. And so what I say in the book is that actually the expertise for the institutional strength and policy advice in labor, social protection, environmental protection, anti-corruption, competition, that's not within the IMF. That's within other institutions like this one. And so if the world really wants to look at and advise countries through these two lenses, we have to change the modality by which that policy advice and analysis gets done. And so I suggest basically that there should be cross-functional teams, a joint office of macroeconomic policy analysis and advice, that per country would together try to hash out the two sides, the distribution and production function analysis, and have what I call a macro development, not just a macroeconomic or macro financial sense of criticality. That, because let's face it, some of the weaknesses in some of these social domains is instability over the medium term for countries. It's not just a function of fiscal monetary policy. Anyway, that's a very, very quick, as quick as I could give answer to how we might operationalize this, the ILO's role in it in particular. And we should not be bashful in doing so.
Can I do a follow-up question on
Yeah.
that? Basically, it's very good to see that you bring in competition within the distribution function. But what you touch upon is to a very large extent antitrust and anti-competition. But I was just wondering to what extent you would like to bring in the whole issue of pricing within it. Pricing. Because unless and until, because, larger part of the distribution function has to do with that. And I'm just wondering whether part of the reason why we are at this juncture today with things and also the collapse of the East Asian financial crisis had to do to a very large extent with the pricing. Right? So is there a possibility to get into an engagement there now?
Yes. And again, very quickly, there's pricing built into that function in several respects. First, on wages, which is a price. In the book, you will see some comparative analysis about living wages compared to minimum wages, which is work that the ILO has done, basically just taking the ILO work. That's a really important, right? And that's a function of policy, let's face it. Second of all, one of the five dimensions is something that most neoliberal thinking people don't think about, but is extremely important, particularly in developing countries, but not only them, which is the price of material necessities. Subsidies kind of has a generically bad name in modern economics. But no, if the bottom line of national economic performance is social welfare at the household level, well, then the availability and affordability of their material necessities is a crucial consideration in countries, but also for countries undergoing shocks. Do you see what happened here in rich countries during the COVID crisis and during the supply side shocks? They put in all sorts of subsidies to try to mitigate the cost of living crisis, right? So anyway, this is not traditionally thought of. This is about prices, right? I could give you some other examples, but regulation on the financial side and on the competition policy side, and indeed on the corruption side of things, strongly affects prices in the real economy, if you will. So this opens up that terrain, I would argue.
Also, just add what has been discussed. I mean, I think the BRICS actually, the aggregate social welfare function is particularly helpful actually when we consider current situation relating to inflation right now. Our monetary policy a bit got lost right now. I mean, they very much worried about for example, the price and wage actually spiral. It didn't happen, but the whole monetary policies actually was undertaken on that assumption. And of course, now it's very clear this inflation, much of the inflation we see have much to do with the market concentration, so that monopoly situation. So actually the much of the inflation pushing factors are coming from the markets system, not actually wages. So right now, because of this actually production function obsession right now, they couldn't look at all these important distribution aspects of the issues. So if once we have that, we can bring those elements all together in our discussion on the monetary and fiscal policies as well. So I think that's what actually the WIG is emphasizing. This is not about the typical Kenneth Arrows actually welfare function for mathematical exercise. This is kind of indicating where we have to look at when we are discussing the policy actually action. So I think that's the strength of this actual book. And anyway, this is another way of encouraging you to read the book whenever you feel bored, you don't feel any hope in the world. Read it. I mean, it's really, really good reading especially for Christmas. And now I'm going to open the floor for comments and questions. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Alev Mine of the One Goal Initiative for Governance. The initiative in question has as an aim to implement, to operationalize something that goes very much in a compatible direction to what you are proposing here. So my thought is how may the initiative collaborate with the ILO in order to successfully operationalize this? In other words, I will talk to you after this.
Thank you. That's very good. And let me see if there are any. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you for this presentation and congratulations, Rick. This really sounds like a very interesting and long-awaited book. So my question is regarding probably the part of the book that you didn't have to present. So this internalizing the social contract has a cost, right? And I believe you developed this in the latest parts of the book, and I would like to hear your views on how can we fund this added cost. I agree with you that in the medium to long term, this will fund itself, isn't a strategy that will fund itself. But in the immediate to short term, when we want to talk to governments and convince them to fund this approach, what are the arguments that we can bring to the table? And I hear when you say that there are certain countries that have a lot of fiscal space, and for these countries, it would be more a matter of political will, but many countries do not have that fiscal space. And I wonder, well, first of all, how to do with these countries that have little fiscal space, but secondly, whether you have thought of any strategy to rebalance through rich countries contributing to countries that have less fiscal space.
Thank you. Actually, this is a very nice question. We have a similar questions from a colleague who actually participates online from the debut Daschle. Let me actually read out the question for you, Rick. While you refer to huge policy space to be utilized and highlights the need to respond to political and social welfare needs, how do you convince governments to spend on policies that boost the aggregate distribution function and aggregate the social welfare function at a time when the fiscal space have been shrinking and globalization and protectionist browbeating and the rise of neoliberal small g government policies? So it's a bit related question there. So probably, let me pick up one more question. Yeah. Okay, so then share.
Well, thanks a lot for this, Rick, and congrats again for the book. I look forward to reading it. My question and comment is firstly on the scope of the work, and obviously you put together a framework that looks at the economic, social, and environmental, and this of course poses the challenge of coherence across policy. And this is a very challenging aspect of working with any government on policy, given the multiple policy objectives and the multiple policy entry points. So partly it's about convincing, ministries of finance, central banks, etc., about how to, broaden their mandates. Of course, we have dual mandates in some countries like the US, or hierarchical setup of mandates. But on the other hand, it's about the coherence between different parts of government. And the area of employment policy where we work on a regular basis, on a daily basis, this is always proven to be very challenging. How do you get a whole of government approach? It's we throw out these words all the time: whole of government approach, integrated approach, comprehensive. But in practice, it requires, of course, leadership and government to take this on. So, within this framework, any practical insights also in line with this operationalization part that you referred to, how to bring this to the right actors who can make decisions on that. I mean, there are some more direct entry points, of course, even in internalizing of costs. Of course, there's been such things as emissions or carbon pricing, right? So there's been a lot of discussion in recent days. IMF just came out a few days back and said, pushing for carbon pricing. I mean, that's a neoclassical answer to the externality of climate change, right? So there, you got one extreme, you got comprehensive approaches which are extremely complex and challenging. On the other hand, you can have more targeted type of interventions. One doesn't rule out the other, and one can be part of, more targeted approaches can be part of a comprehensive framework. But do we put our focus on the comprehensive framework and then try to see the entry points there, or do we look at those separate targeted entry points as a vehicle for getting change in these different areas? Last quick point related to that, in my experience as well, dealing and talking to ministries of finance, etc., is that one area where we do have a small door to engage on is on the analysis of what's going on. So, you talked about beyond GDP, and of course there are frameworks around, I think of New Zealand's living standards framework, which is part of the Treasury's processes and budgeting process. Do you see us at the ILO also using this empirical entry point to bring to the ministries of finance and others to say, look, this is what's happening. These are the implications for the labor market. How can we take advantage of data and empirical analysis to make the case?
So Uma, you have anything to add? So okay, so you remember all the questions? I know you have a great memory of.
There's two basic sets of questions here. So thank you so much for the financial one, because I've spent a lot of time in the book, because this is where the world really needs to get out of its path dependency. But I'll come to that in a sec. First, one practical way of looking at what I'm talking about is that the cabinet in a given country should be holding accountable its economic team for both GDP performance and household living standard performance in these 5 dimensions, in my view. And it should be expecting that they are put on the same level as the measures of national performance, if you will, that then requires, when there's a lag, a gap, underperformance, requires you to look under the hood of that in terms of what policies there are that are not optimized or not sufficient. That's not the way things happen right now in most cabinets, I would view. And so if you have a different mental model, if you have a different growth and development model, and it's particularly for the large number of countries in the world that are advised by all these development institutions and the IMF, if this became the expectation, the norm, right? That we're talking here about aggregate social welfare, not just about GDP. And that these are, yes, we'll have it, we'll look through the part of the telescope at the national level at GDP, but we'll also look at the same time through the other end of the telescope. That is, how do things look in the kitchen table? How's employment and opportunity and entrepreneurial opportunity looking? How's disposable income faring in the key parameters? How's the affordability and accessibility of material necessities faring? How strong, relatively speaking, are those economic security protections, your social protection system and the like, relative to our peers? And how are we doing on not just this, fundamentally on the key aspects of the soil, air, water, pollution, et cetera, in the country? That's a more holistic, you could call it more coherent, but as soon as you say that this is actually the top line preoccupation and what you're going to hold your economic team accountable for, it's not just coherent, it's internalized. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to move behind the friendly clinical talk of policy coherence into like, no, this has to be internalized into the heart of the model itself. A lot of things I think would flow from that, particularly for developing countries if they're hearing it from their advisors who have a lot of power, let's face it, because they're providing financing. Now let me turn to the financing. So I am proposing it essentially in this book, some structural reform of the international economic architecture corresponding to this more aggregate social welfare view of a growth and development model. And arguably the most important one of it, I've already described a little bit the macroeconomic aspect of the changes that would be required. But on the financial side, it's super important because many, many countries have very limited financial space, fiscal space, as you said. And I argue in detail in the book, and if you could put up the slide, Alessandro, on the tripling of external flows to 100+ developing countries, I go through the math and indicate without investing any additional bilateral aid in national legislatures, we have the potential over a 7-year period, which I've notionally set as 24 to 2030, 2030 being the magic year when we're supposed to achieve the SDGs. Although frankly, it will take, it takes a while, absorption capacity and the like to get things going. But the fact is that there is enough resource in the IMF and the system of MDBs with their current capital structures, slightly tweaked and interpreted internally as much as anything else, to generate an over 3% of GDP increase in external flows to 100+ low and middle income developing countries. That is the equivalent in scale of the Marshall Plan, but twice as long. The Marshall Plan lasted about 3.5 years and to a much smaller number of countries. This is what's required to move to scale on the job creating, social protection enhancing, and other dimensions of the SDGs, and moving on climate finance. One of the things I'm suggesting of doing is, if you go to the next slide, is part of that money is embedded in the IMF, but not utilized. And there is a big debate, as many of you will know right now, about special drawing rights. And they did a very nice thing in 2021 of agreeing during the COVID crisis to an extraordinary distribution of liquidity, 650 billion US equivalent of special drawing rights, which is money from the air, if you will. It's fiat money. It's the equivalent of what the US did during the COVID crisis and the Europeans did. They blew out their fiscal rules because they had a crisis. The reality is that the world decades ago created in the IMF the ability to create fiat liquidity for emergencies, or for in many respects it was done because there was fear that there would be a limited amount of liquidity because of the linkage to the US dollar. I want to get into the monetary policy aspects of it. But the reality is, if the world was serious and really viewed the climate crisis as a bona fide crisis, this is the most feasible way we could tap money that would enable us to retire half of the coal-fired power generating capacity in the world, which is it's the biggest obstacle to meeting the Paris goals. You could see about $80 billion could go to that, and that could be leveraged in a few ways that could literally put us on a path to replacing. And that creates a lot of jobs when you replace infrastructure, by the way. Secondly, to create a window for social protection floor financing. This institution's been ringing the bell on the Social Protection Fund, on doing estimates on the gap, but there's no real decisive movement to increase additional funds. Well, if we were really serious about the climate crisis, we would need not only industrial and energy system transformation, we would need a social protection, just transition element to that, and skilling and other aspects of the transitional period. Money could be absolutely provided for that. We could double, in addition to that, renewable energy and sustainable agriculture, R&D, beyond its current levels, which, if you think about coal as the most important near-term thing we need to do to really get on a more realistic track to the well below two degree or maybe 1.5 degree Paris Agreement scenario. It's really the R&D, more medium to long term. This would double that. And also some things on the health side here. The point is that either we could repurpose the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is the way the SDRs are being rechanneled right now. Apologies to those of you who don't follow this, but if you combine that, either a new issuance, and who could argue, the only argument against issuing it when facing a massive crisis facing humanity, the only argument against issuing special liquidity to tackle it is if we thought it was going to be inflationary. Do you really think, does anyone really think that issuing $250 billion worth of SDRs into capital, into the world economy of nearly $100 trillion is going to create any serious inflationary pressure? No. But because we're still thinking in the old model here. If we were serious about social welfare and this being climate being an important part of it, we would say, hey, where's the easiest place to find the money to give us a chance of getting on the track of going to net zero by mid-century? We would immediately realize that this is the way to go to it. There are some constraints under the way it's currently designed. Basically, countries are required when they rechannel to retain a claim on that money because it's viewed as a reserve asset for monetary purposes. That makes it extremely difficult to just donate it for project finance. It's viewed as, it's supposed to stay as a monetary asset for you, even if you on-lend it to somebody else. But that's a political constraint. There is no technical constraint there, I can tell you. It's purely a political decision. If the world decided, because part of Greenland fell off into the ocean, that we now really need to get serious, I can tell you that this is the first place we would look, the IMF, because you don't need to go to national legislatures to get them to reduce their domestic spending on various programs in order to increase foreign aid, right? No, the money is there. I'm probably going on too long here about this, but if you combine this, if you go back to the last slide, with an optimization of the capital that's in the MDBs, you get to this kind of math, which is multiples beyond the $100 billion of climate finance that's being wrestled with in Dubai right now. Multiple beyond the steps, the very good steps that the Indian G20 agreed on, about $20 billion increase MDB money and lending in the capital adequacy reforms. But it's like 1/10 of what's needed. And this thing would actually satisfy the numbers that Nick Stern and others have put and that President Macron used in the Paris summit. This is actually, these numbers add up to the kind of scale of action that they were talking about. That's what would address the fiscal space constraints that you talk about. And the money is there, is what I'm trying to say. If we just had a different mental model and a different set of priorities, different sense of urgency, we would actually be able to find the money, not to solve the whole problem, but to completely put us on a different trajectory of action.
Yeah. So I'm conscious time, so if you can brief.
Yeah. I want to bring you back to the ILO in a way. And I think we've heard about you talking on the internalizing all of these factors in the model. And on the other hand, Shay's been talking about the practical issues because it involves multiple ministries, while we deal largely with the Ministry of Labor in a way. So in practical terms, if you were to move beyond, retiring the trickle-down growth model and saying, okay, this is a way forward, what is it that we should be doing at the ILO? That's one thing. And the second question I have is, you say somewhere in the book that ILO is one of the most important players. It's one, but not the only one. There are a number of other players. So at the policy level, what is it that we need to do to actually address many of these issues and move towards a social welfare function?
Thank you. I don't think the words global coalition have been pronounced during the whole presentation. Yet many elements of the frame you are suggesting bridge very nicely, are a bridge between the pure ILO agenda and the broader audience that the coalition is trying to reach. So how do you see the link? What is the future? What is the follow-up of the book?
So, Rick?
So very good to land this in an ILO context. Thank you, Uma, for nudging us to do that here. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of what I'm trying to do with this book is to better utilize the legacy, the history, the lineage of this institution. Not only its constitution, but very importantly, the Philadelphia Declaration, which laid out the original mental model of global development that I think has been lost. The 70s, 80s World Employment Program, which put basic human needs and employment at the heart of things. And that was a bit of a riposte to the Lewis production function, very much model of things, right?
Yeah.
And then we got lost in the neoliberal, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution and whatnot. And there were reasons for that. There were inefficiencies, but let's not get into that too much here. But the point is that this institution has the mandate to think about the bottom line, the social purpose of economics. We have it in our Constitution. It's why we were created in the first place. The powers that be at that time were really worried that the industrial development was going off the rails because it wasn't responding. It wasn't properly embedded in the social requirements, if you will. And so I'm trying with this book, as Sangheon has rightly identified here, to re-elevate that tradition in the organization. And so one of the ways we matter is by talking about and trying to teach about this different path forward. That's one. The second thing is that I don't think we need to be shy. We can start doing some of this analysis ourselves and advising countries accordingly, and very importantly, going to friends and partners out there, and particularly governments who know that this is a problem, who've been searching. It's been 15 years since the great financial crisis. Lots of projects out there, funders searching for a different model. How do we improve this? This is a systemic way, right? Most of the activity has been very vertical or very specific initiatives. This, I think we can represent as a more systemic, hardwire, the source code, and the kinds of things that I'm invoking here. So we can try to do that. And then I do view the social justice emphasis that our Director General has placed as creating a very nice opening for that. He likes to say, you may have seen it in the hallway here in the screens at one point, that the world needs a major new dose of social justice. Well, I would argue that this gets into the operating system of macroeconomics, and that beyond the very important contribution that can be made on this issue or that problem, this is the kind of thing that gets you to a more systemic behavioral response, if you will, in the system. And so on the coalition itself, I think the coalition is likely to be a very good platform for discussing these issues and for trying to mobilize more commitment and action on specific domains. I don't know that it's going to be a vehicle for remaking the model of growth and development itself. That's for us to try to do by engaging. And now that the book is out there, I think I will begin to try to do that missionary work, and hopefully other colleagues will as well. And maybe we can get some resources to do some specific analyses to concretize it, as I think you're urging us to do. The last thing I want to say is that I call this a Roosevelt consensus model of growth and development, as opposed to a Washington consensus. Why? Because the two presidents Roosevelts, one Republican, the other one Democrat, they engineered 8 decades of this investment in the US economy's institutional makeup across, interestingly, many of these domains that I put in the aggregate distribution function. You could just as easily call that the Philadelphia consensus, because it's on the global side. Washington consensus, the Roosevelt consensus I'm describing is very much the model domestically of how you balance the institutions and rights on the one hand and the markets on the other. The Philadelphia part of that consensus is the global corollary of that. It's the model of global development, if you will. And that's why I view that this is exactly the appropriate institutional platform to have a discussion about this, even if you may get people who will come to us and say, well, what are you guys doing talking about macroeconomics here? You know, no, this goes to the heart of why this institution was created and some of its most influential moments in history. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rick, was Uma, and all the colleagues. 4 takeaway message from my end. First one is the social welfare function. Economists will be very disappointed. There is no easy way, no easy formula to maximize this function, so they wouldn't like it. Second is Rick, you can be a little more ambitious. I mean, you mentioned $2.2 trillion for the supporting or the job creation, social protection, and boosting the living standards. But I think in 2000, the first year of the COVID, I remember the billionaire put together $3.3 trillion. They increased their wealth by $3.3 trillion, when actually the workers lost $3.1 in terms of wage losses. So we can probably increase the number a little bit in that respect. Third one is the global coalition. I always insisting, I mean, I'm always telling this actually to Rick. For me, this book actually provides a very strong intellectual conceptual foundation for the global coalition. So I hope this will be actually kind of taken or well promoted in that respect. Actually, it's probably we could do a bit better on that respect, but this is the beginning of I think the BRICS actually long journey to promote and make sure all the key messages are reflected in the ILO and also the beyond. My fourth message is that this is a great book. Can I tell you once again, this is a great book, really. So for me, this is an important textbook for the newcomers to the ILO. I mean, especially those who actually got a little background of the economics training. With this, we will provide, I mean, what the economists can do in supporting social justice and also decent work within the overall framework of the economic thinking. So that's why I very much like this book. So once again, Rick, great job, great achievement. So big congratulations once again. So let's give a big round of the applause to Rick.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much.
Both of you so much. Yes.
That is really nice. I still feel that what I said earlier, this entire thing should